Hello everyone, and welcome to today's town hall meeting on the adaptation of smart city infrastructure, a supply chain strategy. My name is Steve Anson from the Customer Solutions team at Annixter, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. This session is the 6th in our series of industry conversations that will address not only the city, but also campuses, buildings, healthcare, data centers, and the digital divide. Before we get started, let's go over a couple of housekeeping items for today's discussion. You should see a control panel in the upper right corner that you can minimize with the orange arrow. You have a choice of computer or telephone audio to select from, as well as an option for audience participation via the questions pane below. You may also send in your questions or share comments at any time during the discussion. We will collect these and address them both during and after the webinar. This town hall would not be possible without the collaboration and support of our supplier sponsors, all of whom have relevant solutions to support a strategy for smart city infrastructure. Thank you for your continued partnership. And thank you everyone for joining today. A very big welcome to our panel of subject matter experts from US Ignite, Intelligent Buildings, Marketplace City, Smart City Capital, and Annixter that will provide you with some insight on today's topic and are available to answer questions. But just as importantly as this is a town hall meeting, we really want to hear from you and encourage you to provide your thoughts and comments on how you are solving the need for adaptation of your smart city facilities. To keep this interesting, we'll be running a couple of live polls, so please make sure that you contribute to the poll in order to have your say. So to kick it off today and kick off the conversation and maybe set the stage, I'd like to quote Professor Richard Sennett from the Sensible Cities Lab, MIT Chair, Council on Urban Initiatives, and a United Nations Habitat Chair, who suggests smart cities were all about regulation and control. However, now, post-COVID, represent good programs and protocols, which in turn create community. So starting with Scott Turnbull, Director of Technology at US Ignite, there is no denying there is a lot of adaptation occurring, hopefully in the direction of what Richard Sennett is suggesting. Can you talk us through these current dynamics, but maybe before you do, briefly explain the role of US Ignite and what you play, the part you play in the evolution of smart cities?
Of course. Thank you very much for having me here. US Ignite is a national nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. that is accelerating the smart city movement by creating value through P3 initiatives, cutting across the entire community ecosystem. Our programs include smart gigabit communities, which is over 30 member communities, some smart base initiatives, and other government partnerships and industry partnerships as well. We really focus in that P3 space because we're not going to be able to solve this with an individual silo. We need cooperations on policy, we need cooperations on infrastructure, we need access to infrastructure, we need to evolve our purchasing policies and across the board, and that's what we help with.
Great, and the dynamics we have here on the table, Scott, in a few short words, how do you describe the situation we're in?
What you're talking about is basically how does a city function as an active part of your daily life? That's really the kernel of what a smart city is, right? It's an active participant in this relationship with your daily life. So it can reconfigure itself. It can make going to work at certain times of the day easier than commuting at night. It tells you where parking is, so you're not spending your time looking for parking. I think something like 30% of traffic in a downtown region is cars circling looking for parking at a time. So it can cut all of that out, still provide value to the community, greater connectivity to schools, greater outcomes and quality of life for the people living in it. And the city is an active participant in making that happen, not just a bunch of structures that you move around.
That's a great way to look at it, an active participant. Chris Foreman, co-founder and CEO of Marketplace City, lots of opportunities on the table here. How much of what we're talking about represents an opportunity to accelerate the smart city movement?
Very much of it, actually, Steve. I think it all started somewhat by force in that the cities were no longer able to welcome their employees or residents into City Hall or other government buildings. So they had to be able to provide their services over the web and virtually back to residents. And so that's also sort of spawned new ways to engage residents through their meetings and having open meetings It's engaged new ways to manage spaces, particularly outdoor spaces. So leveraging spaces for pop-up restaurants or pop-up movie theaters in ways that hadn't been done before, but also allowing the policies to flow and follow those changes to behavior. So this is an opportunity for cities to really take a look at how the residents can use their cities in this new environment, and then have the downstream effect on the actual city policy.
And that's a good way to look at it. And Tom, from your point of view as the co-founder of Intelligent Buildings, thanks for joining us today. According to Deloitte, they have defined some of the high-level goals of a smart city to be all about business, people, and the environment. If you come at this from the angle of one of the biggest assets of a city, as its buildings, campuses, and infrastructure, how would you define the goals of a smart city today?
Well, that's a good question, because boy, is that a tall order. And we've seen many unclear, cliche, and even obviously political attempts at that. And there are a lot of important areas of the goals. See, there's obviously the economy, transportation, sustainability, equity, safety. Right? You could go down the list. When you talk about a smart city, it affects nearly everything that we do. So, what we've learned, as you mentioned, from making the built environment smart, with really large customers, including cities and governments and military bases and private portfolios, is that a common sense approach may be more important than a strained definition. And I really appreciated the quote you put up in the beginning where it said programs and protocols. I mean, that sounds kind of mundane, but boy, that mundane is welcome when you're pie in the sky and you can't really get down to taking some action. So a couple of things that we've observed and employed are identify a limited number of outcomes or use cases that you're trying to achieve. And just a quick example, and I shouldn't be in this category, but a use case is not transportation. That's not a use case. It's not an outcome. And a use case is not a bus, right? A use case might be a frictionless way for citizens to leverage mass transit wherever they are to wherever they're going. Now, how do we do that? That's a use case and an outcome. The other thing is enabling and planning for constant change. And that means some basic ideas like don't buy proprietary stuff, foster interoperability between systems and data. And last point, if I could, you mentioned the buildings is, look out your window. In addition to citizens, you see buildings. And they play a huge role in interacting with smart cities and city services.
Good feedback there, Tom. I think we'll dive into that idea in a few moments. If we move across now to Jessica Fossen, as the Annexer lead for innovation and automation in the utility space, one factor that Deloitte mentioned is around sustainability, which ultimately leads to environmental factors. These also can be a threat and an important consideration to mitigate risk within cities and communities. How does a smart city better prepare for such threats?
Absolutely, and really a great question, and something that utilities are really starting to think about. Certainly, as we get inquired all the time about, hey, we've got access to data like we've never had before. A lot of utilities are starting to make the migration into smart automated meter reading systems, and as we start to think about how we can leverage those systems, utilities are now starting to inquire about how do we take this data that we now have and be proactive with the data. So if there are storms, where are the areas we know we're going to see more outages? What are some areas that we need to invest in our infrastructure? And even more so, how do we leverage the communication platforms that we're putting in from a utility perspective to start to grow and have an impact on smart city initiatives that could include environmental sensors and things where we might be able to look at the wind and how much wind is actually pushing on some of the poles and some of the infrastructure that utilities have out there. So utilities are now starting to embrace the ecosystem that we're going to kind of talk through. And it was great to even mention the non-proprietary and the interoperability of different types of technology. And I think that's really going to be a key point we're going to continue to have as we walk through the discussion today.
Excellent. And going into that world of sensors, if you like, Andrew Jimenez, welcome to the discussion as Annexer's Vice President of Technology. Deloitte was also referring to the people, and in today's world, the primary concern of people is safety. What has changed in the past 4 months when it comes to the city's prioritization of public safety?
Again, stating the obvious, COVID has really had an impact on the perception of public safety. I think traditionally when looking at public safety, at least in the spectrum of smart cities, it's really been focused around crime prevention, protection of the citizens against physical harm. But I think where we're at today with COVID-19 is that there's an emphasis around health safety now. So we're in a period of innovation in that there's new technologies that are being deployed and developed to really help and assist in health safety. So specific to what I've been working on in smart buildings, there's things like thermographic camera solutions, for instance, that can do body temperature screening of individuals entering a space. So by looking and identifying potentially symptomatic carriers of COVID-19, you can theoretically reduce the rate of infection in a given area. So these are some of the mechanisms that are out there. There's other solutions like occupancy analytics that are continually evolving. So, social distancing, 6-foot separation, 2-meter separation of individuals. This is a fairly new, concept for people to contend with. And I think technology is evolving to the point where you can detect individuals in a given space, make sure they're social distancing, and plan your spaces appropriately. But I think over the period of the next 6 months will be a period of acceleration, really around innovation of these new technologies, really for the purposes of enhancing the health safety of the citizens and occupants within buildings.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to unpack there with new technologies and bringing them into play. Our next panelist I'd like to introduce, Oscar Bode, CEO of Smart City Capital. You've spent a lot of your life in this space, and based on what we've just heard from the rest of the panelists, can you give us a quick overview of how cities have pivoted their priority for smart cities?
I think what they started to really realize over the last couple of years that becoming smart, a lot of reports out there, it's actually very important for economic development and the ability to finally have a tool that makes things inclusive in a way that wasn't possible in the past. What we all are stressing here is that the pandemic has shifted that from something that was strategic and economic development to mission critical. So I think that now you're starting to see that having a smart city, and even though many people don't understand the definition of it because it could mean different things to different people, I think more and more they're starting to understand connecting everything across the city, all the people in an inclusive way, so then everyone can transform their life and how they engage with each other and with their municipality. So I think those are the things that cities are starting to understand, that the connectivity, all of the applications across and the outcomes that become smart cities are really as critical as water or any other infrastructure to be able to do the remote learning, the telemedicine, and remote work as a long-term ability, not just a short-term or a fad of something. So this is very a significant transformation.
It's such a big transformation. So what we might do is take a quick moment to bring up our first poll question, if you don't mind, Tom, bringing it up on the screen. Thank you. First poll question we have for the audience today is: how would you rate your city's ability to adapt its infrastructure from public safety to public health safety in the past 3 months? Has it been excellent, good, average? Maybe it's been poor. And while we're waiting for everyone to simply select your screen there with your choice, I might go back to Scott and ask him, in your opinion, what is the posture of cities today to adapt, and do they currently have frameworks in place?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's a mixed bag. We look nationally, there's patchy results, but I can tell you the cities that are most successful, they're the ones who have aggressively adopted programs to modernize and simplify their infrastructure, to release capacity, to adopt new technologies, to reduce the overhead and cost of operations, and also free capital. Another thing they've adopted is successful cities have transformed their procurement policies to be more friendly to agile companies, local startups, and other newer technologies.
Thanks, Scott. Tom, how did we go with that first poll question? What were the results?
Looks like average is average. and good is in second place.
Any thoughts about that, Scott?
Yeah, I think that's the mixed bag we're talking about. And you see it if you can't get a driver's license. We're here in the US where you have to renew your driver's license. If you can't do it online, that's a barrier. So where people are seeing anything from communities that handle that well to communities that don't even know how to start. So I think we're in that average prospect, but the good faith of communities trying to work towards that is what I think chips us over into good in most of the cases. It's still a human process.
Absolutely. So plenty of room there for improvement. Clearly, part of the challenge is that lots of cities are being caught off guard. However, some cities seem to be more prepared than others. So back to Chris, have communities that have adopted a smart city strategy been any better off in being able to pivot their resources during these continual changes?
I'd say certainly so, and it's not just having a smart city strategy, but it's having an innovation mindset within the government, but also with key stakeholders that are also part of the community. So I think it's looking internally on a continual basis to see how you can innovate and become more efficient in the way you serve your residents and the way you sort of operate internally, and using technology to better communicate and better manage your internal processes. But also it's maintaining relationships with key stakeholders and community as well. So universities, major employers, and then entrepreneurs and startup hubs, and having that group continually talking to each other. The cities that have that more of an innovative ecosystem and tapping into those resources within their communities, we're able to sort of bounce back or are able to pivot faster than those who didn't have that that type of connection. So I think it's those communities that have been engaging their stakeholders that not only can call on larger employers to help with bouncing back and funding programs, but also with entrepreneurs to come up with new ways to be able to spark new economy and to come back and change the way that the city operates. But also many of them have access to alternative funding sources that are in the venture community or public-private partnership community that they can tap into in times like this, so that they can leverage and move pretty quickly as well. If they're strictly using old school traditional budget processes in order to fund new innovative projects, they'll never get off the ground. The budgets have been set 2 years ago. They won't have access to that now. So if they've been working with the community with alternative funding sources, then they can move now faster than other cities.
Yeah, so some are scrambling, some are already in that trajectory. It's good to see some of those investments have paid off. Oscar, part of solving the gap with connected communities is ensuring that we have the right infrastructure for a connected government.
Yes.
Does there appear to be a lack of online resources that has potentially crippled the government's ability to deliver services?
I think it's a combination of those resources. There are some there, but they're not organized in a way that people can actually, or the cities can actually leverage them in the way that they should be able to. From that, I'm saying one of the key components we always stress is the know-how. So we can provide a lot of information, but to the extent that the cities want to actually leverage it, are able to leverage a type of new business models, as Chris was mentioning, and then maybe be willing to kind of accelerate versus some of the bureaucracy that they may have in place. I think that if they can do those changes, leveraging those online resources could be a big game changer. And then the point of how they go about doing this. So if these resources can actually be implemented, so the focus is to drive what are the outcomes versus the specific box that's being put in front of them, I think that's also going to make a big difference. And the last point is not necessarily, especially in the small and medium cities, being able to collaborate with other cities so their project becomes scalable and executable by a broader group. I think that's also a big change, where in the past cities maybe fought for economic development. I want this company here, I want this benefit here versus that other city. Smart cities actually allow them to collaborate so they both create value, and then their citizens are benefited, not individually. I hope that covers the question.
Yeah, I think it does, and the outcome theme comes up a lot here. What also comes up a lot here is leveraging on what we've got and being able to pivot. And part of what we're dealing with, Tom Shercliffe, is working with what we have, right? So with smart buildings, we don't just rip and replace the systems. What can the cities learn from an intelligent building strategy in leveraging their existing infrastructure?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think there are a lot of analogies there, and just to start out with a fact, if you will, people think about smart buildings and smart cities. Kind of today, we're having that conversation, but buildings have been digital for 40 years. HVAC, elevator, parking, all the systems that are in a building, right? So we have lots of clay to work with there with digital systems. And so if you take that in a little bit broader way, we talked earlier about using what you have in interoperability and creating outcomes and use cases that aren't a system or a feature. And so if we just broaden that out to the city, you can still have these same principles of inventory what you have, what systems, what infrastructure, what data, what contractors, even staff, and then potentially there's some modest upgrades there, and then look for interactions between those things that create use cases. We talked about the bus earlier. It's not a bus, right? It's a whole sequence of getting that outcome, and that's really a mind shift in looking at what do I have that I can start making work together to create a use case and outcome versus all new systems and features. It's a shift, and also you can do that in stages as well.
Yeah, that's very encouraging. Thanks, Tom. I think the misinterpretation of smart city type conversations takes us to this new shiny Star Wars latest tech, and it doesn't seem to be the case. There's other ways of moving the ball here. Jess, some of the aged infrastructure we were just referring to is represented in the utility space, whether that's water, gas, electricity. How have our utilities been able to modernize, remediate, and automate their environment with as little disruption as possible?
Yeah, utilities have really started to go through what we would call almost a grid modernization, where they're taking inventory of really what the grid looks like today and trying to leverage the equipment that will allow them to bring in data, but more importantly, use that data to understand how do we modernize the grid in the most effective way. A really great example of this is there are a lot of distribution automation types of equipment that is available out in the marketplace today. And some utilities are either putting communication devices on legacy equipment to turn things on and off, or they're making investments into products that have what we call decentralized intelligence, where there is algorithms built into some of the technology where if there's if-then statements or if we go above or below certain thresholds, the equipment will operate on its own. So really allowing some of the technology out there to start to make outage restoration a whole lot quicker. Being able to understand if transformers are over and underloaded. And I think as we start to think about even the broader picture, when we start talking about how utilities start to work in this smart city space, we start to think about the communication, not only in what we're looking to communicate from a downstream device perspective, but also making sure that as we start to see down power lines and trees and things of that nature, how do we get the community involved so that that type of information gets put into and streamlines the process of the restoration. So when we think about communication and technology, all of these things are now starting to be part of the picture as we start to think about grid modernization.
Interesting idea there. So Oscar was talking about quality before. I think on this webinar right now, we're experiencing latency. The conversation's moving quicker than the slides. But imagine if we didn't have the power. So the power's sometimes overlooked, and touch wood, we're all good with power right now. But let's just stay on that theme of the concept of the fourth utility, this utility that we take for granted, the internet, which is often assumed and not always available. Scott from US Ignite, this is a big agenda item for you. As cities across the world have been on the journey of developing ubiquitous connectivity, has the topic of the digital divide gained more momentum of late?
I think it absolutely is, and that's apparent to everyone, especially in a COVID world where we're educating from home, we're working from home, we can't all be at home at the same time participating in online meetings. It's just readily apparent. An axiom I like to use with people in presentations is if I told a business you could not access 20 or 30% of your user base, they would move heaven and earth to get to that user base. It's the same thing for the city. It's the difference between being a resident and being a citizen is being able to access and participate in community community and civic resources. And all of these lack of connectivity, all of these failures to invest in infrastructure have some future cost that's often in the tenfold return in terms of the cost to the city. That a failure to invest in education, getting people to work, getting people proper housing, the cost to remediate that down the road is often 10 times what the investment cost would have been for that city. So it is a massive savings and a massive improvement of quality of life to provide those basic ability to participate in your community, to get educated, and to access civil services that you need for your daily life.
So Oscar, connectivity for a community is not just about getting the homes and businesses connected. What are some of the other unanticipated beneficiaries that we can help subsidize the cost of universal network availability?
Well, I mean, I think that's actually been one of the positives. What I was saying in the beginning of this session is we've been able to identify the unlocking of value just by leveraging the assets that the cities and communities have, creating these intelligent corridors. So this new asset class, so where you have the broadband, and the biggest expense is actually the labor part, the building and the trenching. So once you have that connectivity in place, that allows us then to unlock things like connecting all of the assets, so you can reduce savings, you know, from the teens to the maybe 50%. That could generate millions of dollars, even for the average city, of annual savings. You can, through the big data analytics, and again, this is enterprise, not necessarily the consumer, but being able to do from insurance companies that could reduce the number of fatal accidents, the ability to have logistics and other types of companies be able to optimize what they offer. So that value that's now created because you've connected all these things, the lighting, the resiliency, but you create new budget because these now, the data can create value, not just from the community that lives in that city, but the assets that travel through that city. So now even remote rural areas that have 100 to 400,000 trucks and cars coming through their city, they have a new asset class to be able to afford and create these budgets. And to what I said earlier, if we can have a number of these small cities work together, they can then get things like 5G, like a centralized data center, the education. So all of this creates value from a budget standpoint and an improved quality of life that just wasn't possible under the old models and under old technology.
Interesting. So speaking of building and trenching, Jess, we're covering a lot of concepts and strategies, and I think we're in agreement about the challenges and opportunities. And then we're really now looking for ways just to make it happen, right? So can you talk us through how utilities and service providers are doing their part in bridging the gap?
Yeah, I think it really starts with one thing we've been talking about today is making sure that there's education and accessibility to technology. And a lot of that doesn't happen without some form of communication. Utilities have, been working in the communication space for decades so that they can get their data back, whether it's SCADA data, meter data, asset data. And certainly as we start to think about, service providers today, there are a lot of grants and funds available to make it more accessible and easier to procure and access funds for. So certainly as we start to think about these two now, units coming together, the utilities certainly sharing their investment, their knowledge, and also the technology, as well as the service providers coming into cities now, and again, opening the doors, helping folks to get the access, whether through education, through the technology, or even just creating partnerships that really haven't started till today, and starting to talk about smart cities and really the investment by all of the stakeholders in the city that can really bring together an opportunity to create a data location for sensors and certainly all of the health and safety valuable data that we can pull together. So really it opens doors to create that partnership.
Yeah, that's the theme we've heard throughout this smart city conversation now for years, is the bringing the stakeholders together. It is taking a village to build a village. Andy, you've been building different things over the years, more in the data center space. We've seen the data centers move from centralized to off-premise into multi-tenant and co-location environments, more recently to the edge. And as a member of the TIA committee for developing the Edge Manifesto, In addition to, say, let's say, fiber to the X broadband strategies, what solutions and advice can you provide for communities looking to develop improved capabilities at the edge?
I don't know if it's necessarily solutions. So yeah, to your point, the Telecommunications Industry Association, we're developing new guidelines for what we're calling edge data centers. And this is really an outcome or function of the devices that are really proliferating at the edge. So to Jessica's previous examples, if you've got tilt metering, you're talking millions of sensors if you have to censor every tower that's out there. So if you take that across all the device sensors that could potentially be across a particular network, you're talking tens of billions of devices. We're becoming much more process oriented in the way that we have to handle the data at the edge more in a real-time fashion, which means that you can't take the data all the way back to a cloud data center, back to the device to make some sort of decision. It has to happen more in a real-time fashion. So really what's happening is more distributed architectures are starting to be developed, and that's essentially what the edge is going to do. So, some of the characteristics of edge is that it's going to be a much smaller form factor. In the case that we're talking about for broadband, that could look like a more centralized data center if you're doing just pure content delivery, because you've got lots of content that you have to deliver at scale at a high speed to the user. But once you start getting more distributed to multiple sensors and vehicles and towers and these types of things, the form factor gets much smaller. So you need to build in scalability, flexibility into your design. And to some degree, you have to standardize on your design too, because you have to get this equipment out at scale. So what we always talk about when we refer to edge, it's not necessarily a thing, it's really an implementation strategy. The technologies, again, we'll talk about this later, the technology in large part exists already. It's just how do you deploy at scale and how do you process your information in a low latency fashion? Because that's really what the processing requirements now are in terms of the dynamics of what's needed for the devices that are out there.
So Andy, I never leave this conversation without referencing when we pull the data and we put it in the cloud, or we used to have it within a on-premise data center, a new language has evolved around fog. Can you just give us a bit of context? What does fog mean in relevance to cloud and on-premise data centers?
Yeah, so it's really a play on the term cloud. So if you think about clouds at the top layer, your devices are at the bottom layer. Fog is that intermediate layer between the cloud and the devices. So really what you're doing is you're processing what's needed for the devices in terms of determining some sort of action at the device level, and you're processing within a fog or edge node. And what that gives you is this low latency structure that allows you to really process information more in a real-time fashion versus having to take it all the way back to a cloud data center. So you're really talking about the speed of processing at this point.
Yeah, I think the annex, the utility business, the network business, the electrical business is all coming together on this topic. We're working with a lot of cities when it comes to their edge requirements. So love to talk to anyone as they're trying to develop that edge strategy.
Yeah, and one other point too, and Oscar had brought this up, is once 5G becomes implemented in scale next year and in 2022, I think the need for edge data centers and computing environments will even be that much more needed, within the environment.
Yeah, good advice. Tom, I think we've got time now for our second poll question. The question we'd like to ask everybody now is, how relevant are your city infrastructure investments to meet its current or future needs? Are they relevant? So maybe somewhat relevant or not relevant at all? If you could kindly give us your feedback, we're interested in your thoughts there. And while we're doing that, I might take it back to Oscar. Is it a case of here leveraging existing budgets or looking at maybe new ways to raise funds?
I apologize, I had a little problem with the camera there, but the ability is what I was saying earlier, right? How you bring together the different components of a smart city. First, that connectivity, broadband, small cells, Wi-Fi 6, and how you then connect all the assets at the street level and inward. That's the first component. And then how you then go to that savings and the big data. So the ability to solve the know-how of putting that together, that unlocks the value that can help provide some of these projects at very little to no cost if you can combine some of the grants. So that the component that we're going to continue to stress here, that means a different funding model. Instead of using the legacy municipal broadband or pure debt, or just hoping and praying for a grant process that could take a couple years, the reality is if you're able to work with a solution provider that can bring all this together for the city and then unlock that value, it allows for these cities now that before didn't have these options to be able to fund these projects in a way that is either requires no additional taxes. It actually creates budget, doesn't take budget. And if they do it with the right types of public-private partnership structures, they can actually maybe even replace some things that they had in their capital improvement program as part of this smart city project, that then can free up some budget that they already were attaining. The other aspect that we'll see is not only is it just on the communication side, there are today now poles that are solar in nature that generate their own power. There are connected sensors that was brought up here that can reduce the probability of a fire among the assets, etc. So I think it's how all these things come together creates value that is not just important for the city, but there's other large enterprise clients that would be very interested in leveraging that and providing some additional sharing with those communities as part of an additional budget creation. So that's really a lot of things that are being learned today.
Yeah, it's a lot of ways to skin a cat there when it comes to funding. I'm really curious, Tom, as to what our audience is thinking here. What were the results for that second poll question?
It's fairly positive, more than almost 90% say it's relevant or somewhat relevant.
Interesting. Thoughts on that one, Scott or Chris?
I think that's great. I mean, if their investments are there, I think we're all on the precipice of waiting to see that ROI now. We have put a lot of money towards these future initiatives. I think the outcomes, we're at the stage where we need to show returns to the community, and they need to feel it. They need to feel those concrete returns, and they need to feel that improved quality of life. I think a number of communities there's a number of people choosing to live in their communities and not move out to larger cities because of the quality of life, and we're starting to see that. But now we have to start driving and make that apparent, make it transparent, so that people can see the impact of these investments.
Yeah, so that's a good posture there from the audience. Tom Shercliffe, Intelligent Buildings, we just covered the topic of connectivity at a macro level. Let's get down to the relationship, the specifics between the data within our buildings and how that can potentially benefit not only the portfolio of the property, but also the greater requirements of a neighborhood, a district, or even a precinct.
Yeah, so I think you're right. At a property level, I think everybody can, agree and experience, Wi-Fi and broadband and all these types of connectivities. But we also can know, obviously, that existing buildings are literally connected to utilities and other city services, right? So now that begs the question, after all this great conversation, how much more can buildings and properties interface more intimately with city services? And I just give you a high-level example. We have currently 2 mega developments going on right now as customers where the city is using those large developments as the foundational template for their smart city approach. If there's so much scale, they said, wow, let's just look at everything about not only how the developer and property management will operate their buildings, but what can they do and what can the city do then to create this new template. So I think it's, again, there's some obvious connections today, but, the way that you do that, and we've touched on a little bit today, is the first thing is you get rid of silos, because obviously they're antithetical to interoperability. And all of these systems that you can see here on the slide, they have the same basic infrastructure of computers and wires and internet connectivity. So you'd say, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Why don't we have, instead of 10 or 12, sort of haphazardly put together connections, why don't we have one IT backbone in these buildings? And that is sort of the obvious template. But let me tell you a couple reasons why from a real estate perspective is obviously you can see this creates interoperability easier physically, so to speak, and easier access to data. But it's also a better long-term cost structure for the property and much, much easier to manage and maintain cybersecurity. So there's really good fundamental real estate reasons to do this. And just one other note here is that this isn't just a theory. Just in our little corner of the world, we've done this on tens of billions of dollars worth of buildings. So this is happening now for good, solid real estate reasons.
Yeah, so some good lessons learned there, preparing, like the way you say the relationship between the building and the city. So they're preparing themselves for engagement with the city. Let's take that a step further. The building relationship with other buildings within your portfolio, what does it mean there? And more importantly, how does this actually benefit the city?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So it's not that a developer or portfolio would do one of these as a cool science project, right? This is for the fundamental business and risk reasons. This is the way you should do the entire development or your entire portfolio. I will say to your second question, even though you would do these things, let's just be clear, for the total self-interest of the real estate community. I mean, who wouldn't want to be cyber secure with a lower cost structure and more flexibility, right? But those things happen to be the exact same things they needed to do to be able to interface with the city. So having done things for the right development reasons, now we can look and say, wait a minute, what if this building could now, and it can, provide information to first responders about exactly where a problem was and exactly what the conditions and the environment was, where that incident was, not only on the property, but on the floor, in the hallway, exactly where it was. What if police could provide active shooter information, and that helped influence the digital signage and the access control in the elevators? Same thing with severe weather. What about traffic conditions for people leaving the building? Public transportation notifications in the building, and even something that's been going on for a while, but not sometimes kind of clumsy, and interface with the utility for a demand response. So I could go on with those examples, but I just want to be clear. The real estate was done for self-centered real estate reasons, and that was the exact same formula that allows us to connect and participate with all these city services. Very powerful.
Great lessons learned. Thanks for sharing that. And I think if we dive in a little bit further on that topic, Andy, based on what Tom's saying, why are we seeing that maybe we're in a better position today to pull information from the built environment in ways that we couldn't do 5 to 10 years ago?
Well, I think carrying on what Tom was indicating, the technology has really matured across the board. If you look at the full technology stack, which is identified here in this the slide, you have devices that create your information data sets for use. So that's across many different types of facilities: commercial buildings, smart factories, smart cities. So what you need to do is you have to find a way to connect to the devices, and there's a lot of ways to connect. You've got fiber, you've got copper, you've got wireless methods to connect to these different devices. And then you have to find a way to unlock the data that's being generated from these devices. So there's this middle layer of compute that really serves as a purpose of what we call normalizing and aggregating all the data points so you could use it. And at the top layer, you have your analytics that really feed the incomes and insights back to the users that actually need it. So these are the four basic elements of the technology stack. And as it relates to the technology, the sensor technology has evolved. There's many ways to connect devices today. They all support IP. And I think really the challenges that we see is not necessarily that the technology isn't available. It's basically, how do you integrate all this technology in a uniform fashion? There's event stream management, data stream management. Tom had already alluded to this. How do you secure the data that's being generated by these devices? I think those are the principal challenges that are out there. But the good news is that the technology is at a point where it's evolved, where you can deploy these types of solutions and do it pretty effectively. It's just a matter of understanding what you have and how to do the full integration across the different platforms.
Yeah, the possibilities are absolutely changing. And if we start thinking about what is that new normal, the better normal, a different normal, and maybe back, if I go to Scott on this one, if we shift between urbanization, de-densification, between the two, does the ability to leverage data that Andy was referring to from the multiple buildings actually drive the demand and desire for the constituents to maybe be more effective in operating the likes of a neighborhood, a village, or a local community?
Yeah, I thought about this, and I think that I'm not sure it drives the demand for it, but it meets a demand that's unacknowledged and has been there for 40 years. For 40 years, we've increasingly in the U.S. anyway, we've really been driven apart. We're detached. We're out of connection with one another more than we have ever been. Loneliness is one of the largest mental health issues that people face, at least in this country, and that disconnection is driving a dysfunction in everything from how we're prioritizing funding to our political discourse. And we're seeing the results of that now. So I think data can help solidify this identity of ourselves as a community. And once we see that our needs are being met by our city, once we all begin to realize that we're sharing an identity, whether that be communities that are educating our children or seeking jobs for our teenage kids or ourselves, or commuting, and easier commutes are better addressed from us through our generation of data, and that we're actually connected by all of this, and we're all feeding into it, and we're telling our story that that cities are meeting that demand by going towards distributed architecture, but maybe centralized orchestration to make sure that they can moderate and manage the capacity, that they can be transparent in how that data is used, and they can communicate effectively to us. I think all of that in a nutshell will help us realize that we're more connected than we've ever realized we were. The data is exposing that, and the city is now rising to meet the needs that we've had now for 40 years.
Absolutely fascinating. Chris, Marketplace City, you represent a platform that also brings these stakeholders together. What have you learned from your customers and environments similar to what Scott's referring to?
Well, I think what we've seen is that there's much more flexibility for where we conduct business and when we conduct business as well. So I think there's in large urban areas, there's a significant amount of people that commute into this urban area on a daily basis today, and often are using public transportation to be able to get there, and giving up several hours of their day in order to access their work environment. And this time period has demonstrated to all of us that we can conduct some work not from our homes, as opposed to from a traditional office. Now, the next step is maybe we don't work from our homes all the time. Maybe there's some flexibility to where we're not, but we're not always commuting to the same downtown core every day as well. So maybe we're commuting into a local suburban area and performing work in an office building or an office space that might be more of a shared space or a temporary space, but then we're moving downtown in order to have office meetings with clients or what have you. So we have a greater flexibility in how we're working, and then that is then having economic development effects and positive economic development effects on those various regions, and also downstream, it's bringing us closer to our children. It's encouraging the use and spread of broadband in those suburban areas and rural areas where people are going to be working from more often. So I think that flexibility between urbanization and working closer to home has a lot of sort of ripple effect in impacting the infrastructure and the investments that government stakeholders are making, and then the economic development of those more kind of regional or rural type areas.
So it's a lot to cover here, and we've jammed a lot in this hour, and we apologize for that, but there's a lot to put on the table. But we want to get to some practical aspects of this. Oscar, can you talk us through maybe 3 simple things we can all take away from today's webinar as critical ingredients for success?
Yeah, and I think what's showed there are the 3 critical that we stated earlier, whether the project is in small town USA or in some big city in the US or in Europe or anywhere. Really now the knowledge for cities to understand, even in this panel, there's a lot of resources and there's more that could be available, and a lot of it is no charge to these cities. So first understand all these new tools, all of this technology that's now available that can be provided to cities of all sizes, and how they leverage it, either individually or working together. So understanding all of these new things, not just technology, but that also goes to the new business models. It leads us to funding. So, and so now that their projects can be funded in a way because of the new asset class and the value it brings, that's that really significant. And then bringing together that integration, that master integration, because of all the solutions, I think that's also now available in ways that wasn't possible in the past. So if cities can just understand solving these three issues, a majority of cities that are not being able to take effect these smart city projects could do so right away and not have to pay for the entire project. So I think that's really the three components.
That's one of the three components, funding. Well, what are the new funding models? You touched on them earlier. Give me a bit more sort of gravity around what's possible there.
Yeah, and again, today I view a smart city, it's as a real estate play as it is a technology play, to the extent that everything is moving to the edge. Our definition to the edge is the light poles, the assets that are going to be storing. So that creates the new asset class that we were saying. So today, if you look at these intelligent corridors between the fiber connectivity, whether you're a utility or a city by itself, the ability to then, once you have that connectivity, you can overlay all of the other types of use cases we're discussing, the remote learning for everybody, the telemedicine, the reduction in savings across buildings, the reduction in explosions or things. So insurance companies now also contribute. That all creates value. Just autonomous or intelligent vehicles. There's many studies out that intelligent corridors and smart cities can create tens of billions of dollars just by the cars and trucks that go through these cities, because all the data that they create. So being able to understand how to put these things together unlocks that value. So you don't have to, as a city, borrow the money to do the whole project. You don't have to wait 10 years or only do 10%. And if you collaborate with your surrounding cities, now you can make it all work. The other aspect that I will say is that these funding models also make it possible to have real best of class technologies brought to your city. If it wasn't for these, then you're only going to get that provider that can provide the financing, and you don't get every option out there. When you learn how to leverage all this, you unlock the value, and you also expose yourself to get the best solution, not just a solution that's providing you the financing. So I think this is really a big transformation for these cities.
Absolutely, that's a bit of a relief there in some respects. Anyone interested in any of those funding models or what Oscar's referring to, make sure you reach out to Annex, and we'd gladly get back to you. Just to round this out, I'm going to take it back to Jessica Fossen. Lots of strategy, products, technology, and approaches we put on the table today. How are the supply chain strategies adapting to deal with the demand for increased value and as the complexity increases?
Yeah, I think that supply chain is really going to be critical here. Certainly, as we think about smart cities more as a solution compared to a single widget or a single sensor. You know, I mean, historically, we've got folks who are very interested in trying perhaps streetlight control, or they're very interested in gunshot detection, or perhaps some tilt sensors that we were already discussing. And I think as we start to think about how do we roll, you know, all of these initiatives into a smart city solution, we don't look at it as individual pieces, and the word used already on the panel today was working within silos, but really working within you know, full access and full purview of what we're trying to get accomplished. So as we think about the supply chain and really the value add of supply chain, it's really that installation services. How do we make sure that we are procuring technology that is the best of breed, having the education and access to that technology, but also making sure that when we install these pieces of equipment, there's that interoperability. We already talked about how it is important to make sure that if we install a sensor of one type, that it can communicate back to whether it's a head end or perhaps another sensor, but that interoperability and data communication. But also the supply chain is really going to also be a great point for project delivery. How do we make sure that we're procuring all of the proper technology, but also making sure that we have access to all of the suppliers without having to go and contact them individually, but more or less having a team or a single person or team, depending upon how large a project is, to make sure that that solution is delivered in a way that is exactly as you wanted it, but also holding everyone accountable to the end result. And then lastly, that supply chain program. If you're going to make this wide, a wide scale or large scale project, how do you make sure that the products is delivered on time, that there is the solution is exactly as the statement of work describes? Certainly, how do you make sure that the project is being delivered in a way that is as all of the stakeholders implied it to be? And I think supply chain really helps to make sure that all of that is a continuous process. And that's why I would really like to say that I personally feel that supply chain strategy is really a smart city strategy. You got to have one in hand with the other.
That makes sense, and there's a lot of emphasis that's on the planning, and there's nothing wrong with that, and it's very necessary to put that business case up front. The execution, what you're talking about here, is a critical part of the smart city strategy. Absolutely. So, if we just take this now to we're up on the hour, so unfortunately, I think we've run out of time for some Q&A. We have captured everything in terms of the questions that have been posed through the platform. So I'd like to say a very big thank you to everyone for your input today. We really want to continue this conversation. There's certainly been a lot of questions and comments that have come in, and we'll make sure we get back to everybody by email and make sure that we respond to everybody. You can always reach out to your Annex or local account manager to continue the conversation. Please look out for a follow-up on this webinar from the form of a Smart City survey from Anixter and its supplier partners, along with other town hall webinars in the series, as we move together on this journey to adapt within the evolution of the workplace. And at the end of the day, when it comes down to adapting a smart city infrastructure, you need a global supply chain partner that can design and deploy network connectivity, video surveillance, access control, enterprise AV, unified communications, electrical infrastructure, including things such as smart lighting type solutions. And we have all those solutions from our extensive supplier partner network for these on the list here and those beyond. Thank you to these suppliers, the team of panelists, and especially to you for taking time today to join us. We sincerely hope you stay safe, enjoy the rest of your day, and maybe what might be a nice way to summarize this webinar series is to refer to a code from the Smart Cities Council, which is all about a framework that includes all stakeholders, identifies and highlights a scope, principles, and metrics, and acts as a checklist for planning, development, and execution. And maybe as we learn from all the other conversations we've listened to during the Annex to Evolution of the Workplace series, we understand it's going to take a shared responsibility from all of us to adapt our environments and to ultimately achieve smarter outcomes. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.